to SoulWhat, a Soultopia podcast with our producer, Matt Stoker. I am your co-host, Michelle Welch.
And I'm Roger Welch. So what's up today, Michelle?
So today we're really excited to have with us a guest, an author of the book Mutualism, Sara Horowitz. And Sara is the founder of the Freelancers Union and the Freelancers Insurance Company, formerly chair of the board of the board, New York Federal Reserve. She is the daughter of a labor lawyer and granddaughter of a former vice president of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. She lives in Brooklyn, New York with her husband and daughter. Welcome to the show, Sara.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, first of all, I love the cover of your book. It caught my eye immediately. And I want to ask, I think I know why the cover ended up being what it is because of mutualism and the B, and I'm going to ask you about that later. But the title, you guys, is Mutualism, and it says Building the Next Economy from the Ground Up. And your bio is really much longer than this bio that we read, so I think some of the things we ask you about will come out in our questions. But first of all, I just really wanted you to talk about. I wanted to start, before we kind of define mutualism, I wondered if it might be a good idea to explain to our listeners. You talk about the safety net and losing the safety net with our workers in the United States and maybe in other places too, but specifically in the United States, I would say. Could you talk to our listeners and explain what you mean by the safety net?
Yeah, there are so many different ways to think about a safety net. One are the community groups that we're all in together in our faith community, in cooperatives, unions, the mutual aid groups that have arisen in the last year. And then there's the safety net that's like the government policy, the Social Security check, health insurance, that kind of thing. But I think that what we all can agree on or say we feel together is just this lack of a connection to each other that I think we felt so much more in our own communities, a bunch of decades ago.
Yeah, I agree with that. And how do you think like COVID has played into that? I mean, did you begin writing this book before COVID, or I wrote a book that came out during COVID? Okay, so my book, The Magic of Connection, came out. When did it hit? January 8th. And yours just came out on February 16th. So you and I might have been writing at the same time. Who knows? And so I said to my publishers, I was like, do I talk about COVID in the book? Do I not? And so the person who wrote my foreword, who is also an attorney, we're both attorneys. She's also an attorney licensed in, she's IP licensed in New York and California. She wrote the foreword to my book, and she talked about COVID in the book, but I didn't in the book. So when did you start writing, and how did COVID influence any of your writing?
Well, I've been thinking about it because so much of the book really came from my family and my grandmother and grandparents. But COVID, I think, really showed us where we are, just the fact that people are feeling so alone, but also how we have this spirit of coming together. And so I didn't write very much more than the prologue because I had to get the book done in the fall. Mm-hmm. But it definitely showed so much about this country, I think.
Right.
Yeah. So you started the book with talking about your grandfather. Will you tell us a story about him and also how his work helped influence you?
Yeah, so my grandparents were both immigrants, and they came here. They were garment workers, and my grandfather became active in organizing the union. But what was so interesting about that union, and it's was really active in the 1920s, was that they really thought not just about sort of the relationship and the collective bargaining with the employer, but how they could have all sorts of community connections to workers. So they built housing, and my grandmother lived in union housing, and we would go and visit her there. And as you can imagine, there were many generations of people there who were garment workers, and my grandmother would have her beach chair and she'd sit in the front with her friends who she knew for a very long time. And you just could see that there was such a sense of effortless community because they lived near each other. And that's what the housing was. But there was also education, and there was just a real recognition of how we are really three-dimensional. We're not just workers or neighbors or parents. We're everything all together.
Right, how we're holistic. You say at one point in the book, what it's pretty far. I think it's in the second part of the book. You talk about the very beginning. What do you want from work? How do you want to feel? You pose these questions to the reader, and I thought that was really good. How do you want to feel? And that's that holistic thing, because you're not just going to work. Just, we hope some people, maybe it's gotten to that to where we're just getting a paycheck, but it's also, how do you want to feel as a worker? How do you want to be? That's holistic.
How you're connecting with everybody
How
and
you're
the
connecting.
community.
Yeah, because even in chapter 6, you talked about loneliness in working, and I think you talked about gave the example of an Uber driver, and I'm skipping around a little bit because this is further in the book, but I kind of, you just touched on that a little bit about the tribe, the community. What do you think? Even COVID, again, sorry to bring it up again, but it does influence so much now. And that's why I think your book is really timely, because it is showing how much, COVID has shown even more how important your book is. So what do you think COVID even has shown us also about that loneliness and that separation that some may feel?
I really feel like on the one hand, there'll be some parts of us that will go back to the way we did things before. But I think people really had time to think, and really to assess about how they wanted to lead their lives, to not be commuting so much, and to then really think, how do I want to lead my life, and what is really important to me? And I just think that that's so critical. And, I've organized freelance workers pretty much my whole life.
Right.
And the thing I've really learned so much from freelancers is that they really map out their lives. Some months people have to just get a paycheck, and whatever it takes to get some money in. And that's true. And I think everyone has experienced that. But they also really can plan their life in terms of, like, what do I want to do in the day? Do I want to walk my dog? Do I need to be there when my kid comes home? Are my parents aging? And how do I put work in the middle of all of that? And I think that always struck me that was really different from the way we all, in many ways, are forced to work when we're traditional W-2 employees. Right. You got to go in, and then you've got to finish your day, and it's kind of all programmed. And I think that COVID kind of made people freelancers in a way, for them to really get a sense of, what am I doing in that day? And then I think, just as you said, the flip side of that is, how can you not but feel this tremendous anxiety, first about your health, but also really feeling like, in many ways, our institutions failed us. We really didn't feel like there was a plan. I know, especially in the beginning, some states, everybody was wearing masks, and in other states, not so much. And I remember that it was like, hey, what are you supposed to be doing? I had no idea. No one did. Right. And that was so disconcerting,
It was almost like our safety net of our whole country was gone. It felt like, to me, it was like, hello, somebody please. And as small business owners, we've certainly felt that way. And then, of course, in Texas, we were being told different things from, on one side of the street, you were being told one thing to do. And on the other side of the street, it was forum shopping. You were being told something else. You could, from county to county, literally could be across the street, and you were being told something else. So very valid points. And it goes back to, now we're kind of back to that situation in Texas. Matt just asked us off the subject a little bit, but Matt just asked us what we were going to do as Soultopia, because our Texas governor has now said, you don't have to wear a mask. But in our store, the answer is, Matt, we're going to be wearing masks for a while. Yeah, we have some immune compromised people in our store that work here. And so we will be wearing masks for a while, but they have left it to the business owners
Yeah.
to make those decisions. So,
Mhm.
yeah.
A part of why I wrote the book also was because I started to realize how much we had stopped building these kinds of local institutions since really the 1960s. And the thing that made me think that, as we were just talking about that, is that we were all left to figure this out on our own or within our families. And those who were connected, let's say, to a faith community, a church, a mosque, a temple, whatever, at least you could feel like there were other people you trusted that you could share, what you were
Right.
feeling and thinking to get advice. But so many people were just on their own. And we've seen that in the ways that people feel more depressed and anxiety
Mhm.
ridden. And it's all, just such a byproduct of how alone we are. And that's really not the nature of our country. Going back to de Tocqueville,
Right.
we are people that when there's a problem, we rally together, we build our local institutions. And I think that is true in every state in the country.
Mhm.
And that's a commonality that we should focus on, because we have to find some areas to break bread. We're
Yeah.
just too divided right now.
I completely agree. I can completely agree. Um,
So you say, talking about mutualism, and you say that it's not your word that you've made up or anything, and it's been around for a long time. But can you tell us the context of that word in your book?
Could I add right before that, just so because I would want to know this before, along with mutualism, could you answer? Maybe you use the term freelancer as opposed to maybe gig worker, maybe independent contractor. Could you kind of tie that in, if you could, to his
Yeah, of
question?
course.
Okay.
It's funny. So back when I started, if you said the word freelancer, people would think you were talking about people who are unemployed, and they would be like, yeah, they don't really have jobs. And but then, I think people started to get that different kinds of work, a lot of work in technology or in design, in
Hmm.
different kinds of sectors. There were going to be people who work on a project or a short-term basis, and they get a 1099 tax form when
Right.
they fill out their taxes. And then we saw the rise of the gig worker, which has really been in the last few years a focus on people who work for companies like Uber and DoorDash. And you'd probably tell me what are the companies in Texas, but I guess
Those
everyone has
those
Uber.
work. Yeah,
Yeah.
Uber and DoorDash are two of
Yep.
them. Yeah.
Yeah. And so a lot of the people who work there don't have regular schedules and are called gig workers. And there's a lot of, controversy because so much of their work is directed by those platforms. So a lot of people think they really are employees. But the people I focused on were the people who really were freelancers. They really did work that way and liked working that way.
Okay.
But I think what's important is that we start to think about how do we make it so that whatever way you work, you're able to get the money you need, the salary you need, the income, so that you can afford to take care of your kids and that they have the food they need. They can live in a house, an apartment, in a way that lets people feel at ease and have some peace. And I think that's been a big change in the last, you know 30, 40, 50 years, is people really don't feel that right now,
Right.
increasingly. And people who are middle class and working class.
So, how would um, the word mutualism and the word you use and the title of your book tie into that? And could you explain what that is? And then we'll talk about the cover too. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So, so much of where we are right now is people feel very isolated as individuals. And, that really was a worldview. A lot of the view of, let's say, Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher in London, in the UK and England. And what mutualism says is we're actually connected to each other in our own communities. And when you look at it, it tends to be in cooperatives and unions and in faith communities and mutual aid groups. And it has three elements to it. And the first is that people in their own local community come together because they know they have a need. And that need could be for getting food that's cheaper, or getting housing that's more affordable, or just having a spiritual connection and wanting to make sure that they have clergy and a way to be together more regularly. And then the second element is that they pass around the hat, whether it's dues or a subscription, but there's a way that they, in their own community, support themselves and one another. It's not dependent on government, and it's not dependent on foundations or businesses. And the third is that we have a longer term time horizon. The Iroquois nation has a decision-making process that makes one think of 7 generations in the future. And that's, I think, pretty hard for Americans. But if you could just even think 2 and 3 generations, and I think that particularly matters when you see about climate change and other things, that we really have to realize what we're doing right now will impact our grandchildren and their grandchildren. So mutualism is the coming together and recognizing that. And it's kind of a different worldview from the one that we've been used to in the last 50 years, which is, I think, kind of an era of critique, and knowing very carefully and dedicating ourselves to what we disagree with, and not being builders, and kind of going back to our roots and rebuilding again.
Yeah. Finding what we can agree on and starting there, as the Dalai Lama would say, instead of what we disagree on, right? We find that thing we can agree on and start with that, is what I would think. Yeah. You talk a little bit about the isms in your book, and I'll ask the question. You say you get asked the question sometimes about what's the difference between mutualism. There's the word capitalism. There's the word socialism. How would you distinguish between those 3 things?
Yeah. So, capitalism focuses on the individual and the relationship of the individual to business or to the market. And how do you do, and what do you put together? And so a great emphasis on the individual's initiative, et cetera. Socialism really focuses on the government and the relationship on government taking care of people for their basic needs. And mutualism says that both the market of capitalism and having an active government can be fine, but it won't really work well if you don't have these intermediate type of organizations for people to become a part of, because then we get the worst of those 2 if we don't do that. And that's where I think you can allow for a lot of disagreement, because some people want to see a lot of government and some people want to see a really free market. But mutualism lets you navigate both of those, because the most important thing is when communities get together to say what they want, and then they build a government upon that. That is a real democracy. And I think that's the problem, is that we have gotten rid of that part of our society, and we're suffering from it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so too.
Can you explain the 3 principles of mutualism to us?
I think you might have touched. You were touching on them, weren't you, just a second ago? Were those the 3 principles? That's what I thought. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, why don't I just go quickly over them, and then you can tell me what you think.
Okay.
So the first one is that people have to have a community and a social purpose that comes out of that. And so sometimes a community, and like Benjamin Franklin started the first fire mutual because people had their own little fire companies and it wasn't really working. But if they joined together in a geographic area, they could take care of their needs together so much better. And the second is to be able to, essentially pass around the hat, make it so that you have a way to pay for things. And it doesn't have to be like a big thing, but it does have to be something where we have a mutual obligation to one another. And then the third is an ability to pass down wisdom from generation to generation. So it's really those three things together.
Right. Right. So you want to ask a question? I was very interested in one of the story, and I guess I read more than it sounds like I read because I read really fast. But I was interested in your story. I can't remember what it is about Randolph and Rustic. You brought together two stories of two men, and then you tied it in your chapter is Randolph and Rustic, I believe. Do you have time, like briefly, to sort of tell the story of that? And it was really interesting to me how you tied those all together.
First of all, it seems like you really did read the book.
I did.
Yeah, so, one thing is maybe to go back and some of the history about how the role of A. Philip Randolph, he was the founder of the sleeping car porters, the Pullman, the people who worked on the trains, the great Pullman porters. And that was the first Black craft union in the AFL, American Federation of Labor, which had previously been all white. And so he, in effect, and did integrate it. And then as he galvanized the labor movement to care and put its power behind civil rights, he actually was able to pressure the government to integrate the military. And then from there, he and Bayard Rustin, who I'll tell you about in a minute, were the architects of the March on Washington. But what I think they also illustrate is this idea that if you looked at the March on Washington and you said, what were like the biggest things that made this possible, you'd really have to go all the way back to the founding of the craft union, the sleeping car porters. And so what I think mutualism shows is that you really just have to start. And the act of starting something lets you really build something important, and you're able to bridge to other kinds of movements. The thing that's also really amazing about these two men is Bayard Rustin was Black, he was gay, he was Quaker, and he was a brilliant organizer. He went to India and really learned the Gandhian principles of nonviolence. And he was one of the most significant bridges to Martin Luther King to teach about that. And I think they both owe a big debt to the AME Zion Church, which was the church of the Black community who wanted to have their own church and not have to sit in the back of the church. And when you look at, again, you go all the way from generation to generation, you see how much of a role the Black church played in the economic development of so many communities. And so I think that's the really interesting thing to me about mutualism is, you can get started and you right away don't need permission, you don't need government, you don't need anybody. You just have to have your idea and the community that you're with who shares that same need. But often when you look at what happens when people do that, it goes way past that one individual. And I just think that's another really great example of how the things that make us a great country often were the things that were started like 150 years ago, and people kept them alive from generation to generation.
It seems to me, you mentioned as one of the places for community is in churches. And I grew up in church, going to church probably about 3 or 4 times a week, just so you know. I went to church a lot. And my grandfather was a preacher. And especially, I think, in certain churches, and there definitely is community. I mean, that it is a very good example of where community can start, especially you see it when somebody gets sick, or when someone can't go to work, or when somebody's home and in bed. The church will come together. That community, especially, I think here in Dallas and Texas, you really see, if you're not plugged into something like that, you really would kind of be out without a safety net. in a way. And churches here in Texas, I think, are one of the big ways people have that. So if they didn't have church, I mean, I guess one of my biggest questions is, if that's not what someone's drawn to, how would you just start a mutualism group? What would be the grassroots first thing you would do? I mean, let's pick an example. Matt, you do tech work, right?
Yeah.
So what would that be? That would be not graphics. You do all putting together
Audio, video.
Yeah. So within the audio video community, if they wanted to start a mutualism group, what would they do? What would that look like?
Matt, why don't I just throw out an idea or two and you jump in?
Sure.
I mean, I think one thing is that people might want to just network together, and so they could form an audio visual Facebook group or Google group or Slack channel using some pretty simple technology to just come together and to decide what's important. Is it to have a meal? Is it to exchange jobs? Is it to put together a team? And that would be an example where you could get that started right away and ask people to Venmo each other or whatever other way they want to pass the hat, and start to have a leader, and they could get started just like that.
Yeah, I mean, I can say I think that happens in I guess you might call it an ad hoc way, where I've over the years worked with people who, maybe I know somebody, maybe I'm really good at the audio side, but maybe I know somebody who's really good with video, or maybe I know somebody who's really good with websites, or some like project management, right? And so I never looked at it that way as a quasi union of sorts, but it really is when I get presented a project that I can't really handle, but I can lean on people that I know to say, hey, you take this. And then I know that if something comes by and they need a certain type of work done, they'll send it to me. So it's not formalized in any way, but I do think it's important, especially these days. And actually, this was maybe a question I might ask, but like I see a lot of I'm 39, and I see a lot of people younger than me who, and this may be a chicken and egg scenario, but who don't have that drive to be committed to a certain position or a certain job or a certain company, and they bounce around a whole lot. And I don't know if that's because of the company or if that's because of just the mentality of younger people, but something like this that could bind everybody together that says no matter where you are, I know what your skills are and I know what can help could probably be very useful.
Yes. And you know what I think people underestimate, which is what you were talking about with the church, is just having a regular place to come together where people start to really get to know each other. It sounds like, oh, well, how important is that? But it turns out when people actually study these things, like if you take two towns, one that has a strong, let's say, church, and a town that really doesn't, the one with the church just tends to have a better economy. And it just kind of makes sense because people share information, like so-and-so, my kid is looking for a job, or I need some help with this. And people just have a ready-made environment to exchange, which is what a market is. Right. And so I think because we don't have this mutualist muscle memory from past generations, we don't realize that we could really easily just form a little organization and elect a leader and maybe pay some dues of a couple dollars a month, have a holiday party together and get together 4 or 5 times a year and have a listserv or anything that just posts jobs or gigs or whatever we need. And that would really make people feel connected to each other. It'd be surprising to people how much they would feel connected. Mm-hmm. In my neighborhood in Brooklyn, people form, they're in neighborhood organizations. Sometimes when people live in big buildings or, in different kinds of communities, it's really easy to get together. We just don't do it as much, but we have the technology that's making it easier and easier.
Right. It seems like you were almost like let's see, was it 1998 when the freelancers when you founded okay, so
Mhm.
it's almost
Yeah.
like I'm going to use the intuition word here because that was you had some foresight there because like it's 1998 and then after that there's a lot of things that influencers hit kind of right after 1998, right? And so they needed, maybe not right after, but there's influencers, and they're wanting to come together. There's all different types of people needing your type of work or what you're bringing to us with this, and you had this insight into it. It's maybe from what you grew up watching and seeing. It's maybe because of your training. But do you think you intuitively just saw some of this coming, or you felt it coming? Or, I mean, 1998's a while back to know that this was coming down the road.
Yeah, I know. It is kind of a funny thing. I think it's when you deeply know something. I had been immersed, in the union movement with my grandparents, and my father was a lawyer for unions, and my mother was a teacher in a teachers union. I'd studied labor in college, and so I just sort of was in a position to just have a sense of, I guess the way I would put it is I was working as a lawyer and I was misclassified as an independent contractor. So I wasn't given health insurance or the other benefits that everybody else there were a few of us, and everyone who's hired after a certain date. And it got me thinking, I started to say, wait a minute, if we're independent contractors, how could we form a union? But we can't form a union because the laws don't let you unless you're an employee. And then I just started to think about the era of my grandfather and how he did it. And I went to study public policy. And that's when a bunch of ideas sort of came together. And I think also I'm just an entrepreneurial person, which is a strange thing to say because we never, in my family, thought about entrepreneurialism, but I just like putting things together. And I knew that people really needed insurance, and insurance by its very nature is a collective. And so again, when you think about the three things, the three elements, the first was a community of freelancer, and I was one and started to talk to other freelancers. And the second was we needed to have money, and so we could engage in that kind of business that was owned by our nonprofit. And then we had a board and a regular way of passing that wisdom down. So, yeah.
Yeah. So a knowingness of everything that surrounded you, and then knowing it. There was somewhere in the book that you quoted. I don't have the name in front of me, but you quoted, you were talking to someone and they said, how do you know, it's down here, page 93, you talked to someone, you can tell the story, and they just said that they listened to workers and they solved their problems. That's kind of what you're talking about. Do you remember what I'm talking about here? You talked to a friend or someone that you knew, and they...
Oh, yeah. No, that's God, you really read this book. A for you, A+. Sidney Hillman was the president of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union, and his daughter actually just passed away, and she lived well over 90 years old, which was remarkable. And so when I started, I tracked her down and talked to her, and I was like, how did he pick what to do? Like, how do you know whether you're going to build a bank or an insurance company? Those are pretty big things. And that's what she said to me. He said, just listen to the workers, figure out what they're saying, what their problem is, and start to solve that problem.
And that's what he invested in, right? So I thought that was really interesting, and that ties into what you've done is you just listen to the workers and what they need, and then you solve that problem.
So,
but one thing that's funny about life is, like, when she said it to me, I literally can remember being on the phone and I was like, what? That's not helpful. What does that mean? Mm-hmm. But I just kept thinking about it. And I think it was really profound.
Yeah, I think so too.
So your freelancer union that you have now, I was listening and it's a C4 union, correct, versus a C5 union? And so what's the differences there?
Yeah. Wow. The two of you, very, very, very impressive here.
Thank you.
So, because freelancers, and let me just say, I am no longer at the Freelancers Union. The new head is named Rafael Espinal, who is doing a great job.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm a good founder who left, so it could continue from generation to generation. But what happened was that freelancers are independent contractors, and so they literally, because they're not employees, they can't unionize in the traditional sense.
Mm.
And so, there are a bunch of different nonprofit categories, and a C4 is where people can come together, they can engage in advocacy, and we had that plus a 501c3, which is a traditional nonprofit. And then we were able to provide insurance and other kinds of things like that, and also engage in advocacy. So one of the major things we did in New York City was something called Freelance Isn't Free, so that if you hire a freelancer, you have to have a contract and you have to pay them within 30 days. And if you don't pay them, and that's been shown to be the case, then it's double damages and attorney's fees, which is a big deal. So it really has some teeth to it, because we found that all over the country, it's very common for freelancers to do work, as I'm sure Matt will tell you, and then not get paid.
He's shaking his head. He's shaking his head. He's got something to say.
Yeah, not here, not here. But yeah,
Not here,
there,
not here.
it is. It's a weird sort of, I guess, flip of what you would normally consider to be work, whereas it's incumbent on the employee to chase down their paycheck each time they do it. The employee, I understand that's not the exact relationship, but it is incumbent on you as the professional to chase down and get paid, rather than on the company to pay you in a timely manner.
Right.
And there are people who do absolutely take advantage of that. So I think that's great, having some sort of real power behind you, to where you can say you can't do this. It's not just a matter of, well, you didn't pay me this time, so I'm not going to work with you again. It's, I will get that out of you one way or another.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And you'll get yours out of us right at the end of the show.
I always do. I always do.
All right. Pretty good about that.
Yeah, always.
So I just want to say, Roger, you are fidgeting around tonight.
It's my arm.
It's your arm. Is
Yeah,
it
it still
okay?
hurts.
I'm just, I was a little bit worried about you there. He never fidgets this much, sir. So I had to ask him, what's going on over there? He's been going to the chiropractor for his arm. I think the chiropractor may be a freelancer.
Yeah, it could be.
No, I'm serious. At that place, there's a place here in town, and I think they are freelancers at that.
I think so.
Yeah,
Actually, he keeps asking to come on the show.
So, but he needs to fix your arm first.
know,
and then
right?
maybe we'll have him. I'm kidding. Yeah. So back to a little bit, or did you?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So COVID. It seems like, as a small business owner, maybe I could be wrong. I know it's hit some big businesses, but at the beginning, the big businesses kind of snuck in and got that money really fast. What was it? The PPP. The PPP money and stuff like that. It seems like maybe, this is actually from one of our listeners who has had this question for you. He said, it seems that COVID has hit small business owners much harder than large corporations who had the ability perhaps to deal with all the guidelines the states enforced. How do you think they, meaning small businesses, will recover, or will they ever recover? And then what I added, maybe what protections, or how would the freelance unions potentially tie into that for I know they're businesses or small businesses, but maybe the workers within those small businesses.
Yeah, I totally agree that the small businesses and solo practitioners especially were so hard hit. I mean, they just don't have the cash that these big businesses did to tide them over. And then, just as this listener said, they could go and get that money much faster because they had staff and experts, who could apply. And I think that's where, when you hear people say that the economy is fine and we're completely in recovery, I just see an economy where the people who are in the middle are really struggling and not doing well. And, I really hope that President Biden, really focuses on that, because I think that's where we're seeing so many people struggle. I would say one area that was very hopeful was that in the last initiatives, the last bills that came out
Right.
of DC, the freelancers and independent workers and small businesses were included. But for freelancers in particular, this was the first time ever that they were eligible for unemployment insurance.
So how do they know that, I wonder? I mean, is that something that's stuck in the bill somewhere that's hard to find, or is that something that's being, it's all over the
Broadcasted
news,
out.
broadcast over on the news?
Well, this is a really good example of mutualism, because the freelancers union, one of the major things it does is help people find out, what's in the law, what should be in the law. I just actually did a program with them about 2 weeks ago with Senator Schumer from New York, really urging the senator to keep up with specific things. And I'm sure that as people are active in their states with the freelancers union, they can get to their local elected officials to tell them what they need. I'd say one thing is to go look at the freelancers union,
Okay.
especially to find out about those kinds of things.
Because you know how sometimes those things are just hidden in the bill somewhere, and even us reading emergency orders, going back to that, I was reading emergency orders, and I would catch things in emergency orders during COVID. It's different than a bill, but then I'd have to go read a whole bill that would be referred to in an emergency order. And I'm thinking, how can people who aren't even, I'm a lawyer I didn't even do this for a living, that type of law, and I'm trying to figure this out.
I know, it's really crazy.
It is crazy.
And that's what I think, when I think back a year ago, as people were struggling, like literally their businesses were closing or all their work just dried up. And it was just completely unclear. It was unclear what you would get. It was unclear what the process was. And people didn't have a place to go. They were trying to go to like government websites, and it was insane. And I really think that the whole way that we structure things it should be through the groups that people are in that they trust and feel comfortable in. And, everybody can go to different kinds of groups. It's not like we just have to have one big one. Some people like living in a rural area, and some people like being in an urban area, and some people are of faith and believe in God, and other people that's, nothing doesn't resonate with them at all. We're human, we're different, but there's so many ways that we can come together. And so that's what you need to do in times of COVID and other kinds of things, is you need to find the information with the group that cares about you.
Right. Are there freelancer unions is there a freelancer union? Is it state by state in every state?
It's national, but there are a lot of different freelancer meetups in a bunch of different cities. And I actually don't know right now if there's one in Texas. And I know in COVID that they're organizing virtually, as opposed to obviously in person. But yeah, it's national, and you could just go to the freelancers union to look that up.
All right. So we were talking that your daughter is in school, and you talked about that in the book, and that we have some kids in college. What advice would you give them regarding what we're talking about tonight, regarding your book, Mutualism?
Yeah. Well, I think it's really important to find your community and to pay attention to that and the things that you care about, and be a part of things. We are really active in our synagogue, and that, as you were talking about your church, it really makes you feel connected. People really know you. So I hope that I live it and have imparted that to her. And, also really, having a thing that you really deeply care about and pursuing that. And I think that's really important. But it's not just for you as an individual. It's really trying to figure out your higher purpose,
Right. And we definitely agree with that. That's that's the big thing for me that I wrote about in the book is we're all connected. And so connecting to our higher purpose, to if we're hurting one, we're hurting all. There is a ripple effect, and people need to start realizing that. And I think that you talk about that too. I mean, if people can start realizing that what is done to one is done to the community, it is done to all. And I think that's what my whole book was about, and that's why it was so timely during COVID, because it seemed to get just more and more and more divisive when I was thinking, can't we come together more and more and more than ever? This is when we need to come together. And so to have places, and whether it be workplaces or community, whatever it is, something that ties you to something, I think is important for young people, for all of us, right? I wanted to talk about the cover of the book. Can you show it, Matt?
Hold it up.
Or
for the
hold it up?
camera.
Okay.
Yeah. I can show it that way.
I've got it all bookmarked here, but so the cover of the book, Sarah, we're showing it, and it's because you said you didn't come up with the word mutualism. It's been around for a really long time, and I'm assuming this cover of the book, that's good, Roger. Could you explain about what the cover of the book is about?
Yeah. Well, a lot of mutualism is biology and the ways that we have to have ecosystems that are independent and dependent on one another. And so the bees need the pollen and the flowers need to be pollinated. And so it really is this metaphor for how we have to relate to each other, just as what you were saying. I think there's really nothing wrong with people disagreeing, but the best disagreements are when people are connected to one another, trying to achieve a goal together, and I think
Absolutely.
nature really shows us all these systems where each element needs one another. And that's really what the book is about. And then I also feel like that we just are facing really big challenges, really our children and their children. And these are going to be important. It's not like economic issues, it's not like some abstract thing that's far away. And it's the coming together. And I think it's also the joy in life is the coming together with other people. That's over the long term. Really, that's how you judge your life. It's what you built and who you are connected to.
I agree with you.
Cool.
We're gonna throw some things at you really fast, and then we'll wrap it up with the website from you. But I'll throw the first one at you. Just give it maybe one sentence. The future of labor. One sentence. Sarah, go.
The future of labor is working workers and working people coming together to solve their problems.
Okay.
Yeah, future of the government.
Future of government is to build mutualism and not replace the beautiful mutualist organizations that are built locally.
These are chapters in her book, you guys. Future of capital market for mutualism.
To start to recognize that you have to be able to fund things, not, this is going to be way more than one sentence.
Okay,
You have to have it so that we can build these, the things that help solve our problems locally. Nobody's looking to get rich, and nor do you want to subsidize everything forever, but you have to have an ability to pay for this and help these things get started.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And future of how to be a builder for people.
I think it's so much of what we've been talking about, to really check yourself before you start to criticize and think about the solution. And not just the solution, but what's the task at hand and how can you make something happen? And in that context, you can get yourself to be more of a builder than just a critiquer.
I love that.
Very cool.
I talk about minding our own energy first before we get into the energy. So yeah, check yourself before you're checking everybody else, right? So I love how that's tied together.
Yeah, definitely.
Correct?
So
Thank you so much for being on. Can you give us some information on how people can get a hold of, can get your book and there's a website you said that you would like to give out for our listeners?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that. People can go to buildmutualism.net, and there's a little dash between them, Build Mutualism. And you can buy the book, and you can also sign up if you want any information about future events or what we're doing. And it also goes into a little bit more detail about the different elements and the different types of mutualist organizations you might know.
Excellent.
Awesome.
Thank
Great
you
time.
so much for coming on. I loved your book, and I encourage everyone to get it. And even if you don't know that much about all of this that you think you do, it's written in such a way that you understand it. And I love the stories in there too. I love the fact that you put wove stories through. So I would encourage anybody who loves just really good storytelling, and there's good history in the book too. It's called Mutualism, Building the Next Economy from the Ground Up, Mutualism by Sara Horowitz. Thank you so much, Sara, for joining us.
Thank you, Sara.
Thank you so much. It really was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks for listening tonight, everyone, where we discuss matters that are important to our soul, and you get to discern and decide what matters to yours. Thanks for joining us.
Good night, guys.